What if an entire town was built on top of something that should have stayed buried? Before we explore one of the most documented paranormal locations in American history, drop a comment below and tell us from where you are watching. Have you ever felt a presence you couldn't explain? A cold touch in an empty room, voices where no one should be? Keep that thought close, because today we're venturing into a place where the boundary between our world and whatever lies beyond has worn dangerously thin. It's present day in Waverly Hills, Kentucky, a place whose very name sends chills down the spines of paranormal investigators worldwide. Perched on an isolated hilltop overlooking Louisville, the abandoned Waverly Hills Sanatorium stands like a monument to suffering, a massive Gothic revival structure whose empty windows stare out over the Ohio River Valley like the hollow eyes of something long dead, but not quite gone. This isn't just another haunted building with unverified ghost stories passed down through generations. Waverly Hills has been investigated by dozens of professional paranormal research teams, featured in multiple television documentaries, and has accumulated thousands of witness testimonies describing encounters that defy rational explanation. The activity here is so consistent, so well documented, that even skeptics who visit often leave questioning everything they thought they knew about the nature of reality. But to understand why Waverly Hills is the way it is, we need to go back to the beginning, to 1910. When the facility first opened its doors with the best of intentions and the worst possible timing. Tuberculosis. The White Plague. The captain of death. In the early 20th century, tuberculosis was the leading cause of death in the United States, killing 1 in 7 people. It was a horrific disease, a bacterial infection that literally consumed the lungs from the inside, causing victims to slowly suffocate over months or years while coughing up blood and wasting away to skeletal shadows of their former selves. There was no cure, no effective treatment, only quarantine and a slim hope that fresh air and rest might somehow allow the body to fight off the infection. Louisville, Kentucky, with its position along the Ohio River, was a tuberculosis hotspot. The humid climate, industrial pollution, and crowded living conditions created perfect breeding grounds for the disease. By 1910, the city was in crisis, with thousands of cases and nowhere to properly isolate and treat the sick. The Jefferson County Board of Health made the decision to build a specialized tuberculosis hospital on a hilltop south of the city, where the air was cleaner and patients could be kept far from the general population. They chose a location called Waverly Hills, named after the Waverly novels that were popular at the time. The original building was a small 2-story wooden structure designed to house 40 to 50 patients. It opened in 1910 with high hopes and genuine compassion for the suffering. Doctors and nurses came to work there believing they could make a difference, that modern medicine and fresh air treatment would give their patients a fighting chance. They had no idea they were building the gates to hell. Within a few years, it became horrifically clear that the original building was nowhere near large enough. Tuberculosis cases were exploding, and Louisville needed a much larger facility. In 1924, construction began on a massive new building, a 5-story Gothic revival structure that could accommodate over 400 patients. It was designed according to the latest medical theories, with open-air porches on every floor where patients could be wheeled outside regardless of weather, exposed to the elements in the belief that fresh air and sunlight would help kill the bacteria ravaging their lungs. The new Waverly Hills Sanatorium opened in 1926, and almost immediately it began filling with the dying. Understand that tuberculosis treatment in the 1920s and 30s was barbaric by modern standards. Doctors would perform procedures called thoracoplasty, literally removing ribs to collapse infected lungs, hoping that immobilizing the lung tissue would allow it to heal. They would perform pneumothorax procedures, puncturing the lung and filling the chest cavity with air to compress the diseased tissue. They tried everything: experimental surgeries, untested medications, treatments that often killed patients faster than the disease itself. And through it all, people kept dying. Not dozens, not hundreds, thousands. Conservative estimates suggest that during Waverly Hills' peak operating years from 1926 to 1961, approximately 8,000 people died within its walls. Some researchers believe the actual number was significantly higher, possibly exceeding 60,000 deaths when you account for the original building's casualties and the most devastating years of the tuberculosis epidemic. That's an average of 1 death per day, every single day, for decades. But the dying wasn't the worst part. The worst part was how the facility tried to hide it. Hospital administration was acutely aware that watching fellow patients die was devastating to morale and recovery. Tuberculosis patients needed hope, needed to believe they could survive, but that hope died a little every time they watched another body being carried out. So the administrators made a decision. They would hide the dead. Running down the hillside from the sanatorium's bottom floor was a tunnel, originally built to provide access to the hilltop facility during Kentucky's harsh winters. It was 500 feet long, sloping downward at a steep angle, with stairs on one side and a motorized rail system on the other. Hospital staff used it to transport supplies up the hill without having to brave snow and ice on the exterior roads. But starting in the late 1920s, that tunnel gained a new purpose. It became the death tunnel. Every day, sometimes multiple times per day, orderlies would load bodies onto the rail system and send them down into the tunnel, where they would be collected at the bottom and removed from the property away from the sight of living patients. The bodies would pile up down there in the darkness, waiting for transport to the morgue, sometimes for hours, sometimes for days, when death rates spiked during particularly bad outbreaks. The tunnel was never properly ventilated. It was damp, cold, and utterly lightless, except for the occasional electric bulb that barely penetrated the gloom. Staff hated going down there. They reported feeling watched, hearing things moving in the darkness, experiencing overwhelming sensations of dread that had nothing to do with the grim task of body removal. One orderly, a man named Robert Keene, who worked at Waverly from 1947 to 1953, gave an interview in 1998 that was recorded by local historians. He described the death tunnel in terms that still disturbed those who listened to the recording. He said that after a while, the tunnel started to feel alive, like it had developed awareness and hunger. He described hearing breathing sounds echoing from the deep darkness, feeling cold hands brush against him when he was alone, seeing shadows move independently of any light source. Robert Keene quit his job at Waverly Hills suddenly in 1953, refusing to ever explain exactly what happened during his final shift. He would only say that something in the death tunnel had tried to follow him home, and that he had narrowly escaped becoming part of whatever was gathering strength down there in the dark. He moved to Florida immediately after quitting and never returned to Kentucky. But the death tunnel wasn't the only place where darkness was accumulating. Room 502, located on the 5th floor of the sanatorium, became infamous among staff and patients alike. It was a room where suicides happened with disturbing frequency, far more than statistical probability could explain. The most documented case involved a nurse in 1928, a 29-year-old woman named Lois Higgs who worked the night shift on the 5th floor. Lois was found hanging from a light fixture in room 502 early one morning by a colleague coming to relieve her shift. There was no note, no explanation, no prior indication that she was suicidal. Her family insisted she had been happy, looking forward to her upcoming wedding, excited about her life. The official report called it suicide due to stress from working with dying patients, but those who knew Lois rejected that explanation completely. What made Lois's death even more disturbing was what happened in the weeks leading up to it. Multiple patients and staff reported seeing Lois acting strangely during her night shifts, standing motionless in corners, staring at walls, having one-sided conversations with empty air. When confronted, she would snap back to normal, claiming she didn't remember doing any of those things. She complained of nightmares, of feeling like someone was calling to her from the upper floors, of an overwhelming compulsion to go up to room 502 even though it terrified her. The night she died, 3 different patients on the 5th floor reported hearing a woman screaming, but when staff investigated, they found nothing unusual. It was only in the morning that Lois's body was discovered, swinging gently in room 502, her face frozen in an expression of absolute terror. The room was closed immediately after her death, but the closures never lasted long. Waverly was always overcrowded, always desperate for space, so eventually room 502 would be reopened and new patients would be placed there. And almost without exception, patients in room 502 deteriorated faster than those in other rooms. They reported nightmares, hallucinations, voices telling them to give up, cold spots that seemed to drain their energy. Several patients begged to be moved to different rooms, but overcrowding meant their requests were usually denied. In 1932, another nurse assigned to the 5th floor threw herself from the roof patio outside room 502, plunging to her death on the concrete below. Again, there was no note, no clear explanation. Colleagues said she had seemed fine, maybe a little tired, but nothing suggesting suicidal ideation. Her death was ruled accidental, claimed she had simply leaned too far over the railing, but those who knew the layout questioned that explanation. The railing was chest-high and sturdy. You would have to deliberately climb over it to fall. By the 1940s, Room 502 had a reputation that even the most desperate patients feared. Being assigned there was seen as a death sentence, not from tuberculosis, but from something else, something that lived in that room and fed on suffering. The introduction of streptomycin in 1943 finally provided an effective treatment for tuberculosis, but it came too late for the thousands who had already died at Waverly Hills. The sanatorium continued operating through the 1950s, treating the remaining cases and transitioning toward other types of care. By 1961, with tuberculosis largely under control, Waverly Hills closed as a tuberculosis hospital and was converted into Woodhaven Geriatrics Hospital, a facility for the elderly. But the conversion didn't end the darkness. If anything, it got worse. Woodhaven operated from 1962 to 1981, and during those years, allegations of patient abuse, neglect, and illegal medical experimentation plagued the facility. Multiple investigations by state authorities uncovered horrific conditions, patients left in their own waste for days, elderly residents beaten by staff, experimental psychiatric treatments performed without consent or proper medical supervision. The facility was finally shut down in 1981 amid a scandal that sent several staff members to prison and left dozens of families seeking justice for their mistreated relatives. Between the tuberculosis deaths and the geriatric hospital abuses, Waverly Hills had accumulated an estimated 60,000 to 70,000 deaths on the property over 7 decades. That's an incomprehensible amount of suffering concentrated in one location, pain and fear and despair soaking into the very structure of the building, saturating its walls and floors with decades of anguish. The building sat abandoned after 1981, slowly deteriorating as vandals broke in, homeless people sought shelter, and local teenagers used it for parties and dares. But everyone who spent time in the abandoned sanatorium reported the same things: overwhelming feelings of being watched, unexplained sounds, shadow figures moving through corridors, voices calling out from empty rooms, and a pervasive sense of malevolence that seemed to intensify the deeper you went into the building and the longer you stayed. In 2001, Waverly Hills was purchased by Charlie and Tina Mattingly, a couple who intended to preserve the historic building and operate it as a tourist attraction and paranormal research facility. They've owned it ever since, conducting regular tours and allowing legitimate paranormal investigation teams to study the property extensively. And what those investigations have documented is extraordinary. The Death Tunnel remains one of the most active paranormal locations in the entire facility. Dozens of investigation teams using various types of equipment have recorded similar phenomena: shadow figures moving through the tunnel independent of light sources, unexplained cold spots that drop temperatures by 20 or more degrees within seconds, EVP recordings capturing voices saying things like, "Get out, help me," and "Stay," and physical interactions including people being touched, pushed, and having their clothing tugged by invisible forces. In 2006, an investigation team from the Atlantic Paranormal Society captured thermal imaging footage in the Death Tunnel, showing what appears to be a humanoid heat signature moving up the stairs toward them, despite no living person being in that location. The figure moves with unnatural smoothness, doesn't generate any sound despite walking on metal stairs that should echo loudly, and appears to stop directly in front of the lead investigator before suddenly vanishing from the thermal camera. Room 502 continues to be a focal point of activity. Visitors report the door slamming shut by itself, the sound of a woman crying coming from inside the empty room, and shadow figures appearing in the doorway before retreating back into the room. Multiple photographs taken in Room 502 show strange light anomalies and what appear to be partial human figures that weren't visible to the naked eye when the photos were taken. One particularly disturbing incident occurred in 2009 when a group of paranormal investigators spent the night in Room 502. Around 3 a.m., all of their equipment simultaneously malfunctioned. Cameras stopped working, audio recorders shut off, flashlights died despite fresh batteries. In the sudden darkness, the lead investigator reported feeling hands close around his throat, not violently, but with steady pressure that made it increasingly difficult to breathe. His team could hear him choking, but couldn't see what was happening. When they finally got emergency lights working again, the investigator had visible handprints on his throat that hadn't been there moments before. The marks faded within hours, but photographs taken immediately after the incident clearly show finger-shaped bruising. The fourth floor is known for what witnesses call the shadow people. dark humanoid figures that appear solid but cast no shadow and seem to absorb light rather than reflect it. These figures have been reported by hundreds of visitors over the years, all describing similar encounters. Tall, human-shaped shadows that move with purpose through the corridors, often appearing to observe visitors before moving away through walls or simply vanishing. In 2012, a visitor named Jennifer Holbrook captured video on her phone showing one of these shadow figures. The footage, which has been analyzed by multiple video forensic experts who found no evidence of tampering, shows a clearly defined human-shaped shadow moving across a doorway in a corridor where no one else was present. The shadow appears to notice it's being filmed, turns to face the camera directly, and then moves backward through the wall behind it, defying all physical laws. The surgical wing on the third floor is another hotspot of activity. This is where the most invasive and often fatal procedures were performed during the tuberculosis years. Visitors report hearing screaming coming from empty operating rooms, seeing spectral figures on surgical tables, and experiencing overwhelming panic attacks that forced them to flee the area. Several people have reported being touched or grabbed in the surgical wing, always describing the sensation as ice cold and accompanied by a feeling of malicious intent. A particularly chilling encounter was reported by a nurse who participated in an overnight investigation in 2015. She was standing alone in one of the former operating rooms when she felt something grab her wrist with tremendous force. She looked down and saw what she described as a translucent hand, thin and skeletal, gripping her arm so tightly it left marks. The hand appeared to be pulling her toward the operating table, and she could hear a voice whispering, "Help me, help me, help me," over and over. She screamed, and other investigators rushed in, at which point the hand vanished and the whispering stopped. The woman had bruising on her wrist and the pattern of finger grips that took weeks to fade. The children's ward on the third floor presents a different type of activity, less malevolent but deeply disturbing in its own way. Tuberculosis didn't spare children, and dozens of young patients died at Waverly Hills over the decades. The children's ward is known for the sounds of children playing, laughing, crying, calling for their mothers. Balls have been known to roll across floors by themselves. Toys have moved from one location to another overnight, and visitors often report feeling small hands taking theirs or tugging at their clothing. One of the most documented child spirits is a little boy who appears around 6 or 7 years old, wearing what looks like 1930s-era clothing. He's been seen by numerous witnesses, always in the same area of the third floor, often playing with a rubber ball. Several people have reported interacting with him, having brief conversations where he talks about wanting to go home and asking when his mother is coming. When visitors try to engage with him more deeply or approach too closely, he typically vanishes, sometimes with a look of fear on his face. The activity at Waverly Hills isn't random or sporadic. It follows patterns, intensifies during certain times of year, particularly around Halloween and during the winter months, and seems to respond to certain triggers. Many investigators report that the spirits, or whatever they should be called, appear to be more active when visitors show fear or distress. It's as if negative emotions feed the phenomenon, making it stronger and more capable of manifesting. Oh. Dr. Yu, Sarah Mitchell. A parapsychologist who has studied Waverly Hills extensively published a paper in 2018 suggesting that the sheer concentration of death and suffering at the location may have created what she calls a psychic residue, an accumulation of emotional and spiritual energy that has fundamentally altered the nature of the space itself. She proposes that Waverly Hills has become a thin place, a location where the barrier between our reality and whatever lies beyond has worn so thin that crossover events occur regularly and predictably. Her research included surveys of over 500 people who had visited Waverly Hills, including both believers and skeptics. Of those surveyed, 83% reported experiencing at least one unexplained phenomenon during their visit, things they couldn't rationally explain. Even among self-identified skeptics, 67% admitted to experiencing something that challenged their worldview. The Mattingly family, who owned the property, maintained detailed logs of reported paranormal activity. These logs, spanning nearly 2 decades, show consistent patterns in the type and location of phenomena reported. Room 502 generates reports almost every single night tours are run. The death tunnel produces documented activity in approximately 70% of investigations. The fourth floor shadow people are reported multiple times per week during active seasons. This isn't the kind of random, sporadic activity typical of locations with exaggerated haunted reputations. This is systematic, predictable, and thoroughly documented by hundreds of independent witnesses. But perhaps the most disturbing aspect of Waverly Hills isn't what happens inside the building. It's what follows people home. There are dozens of reports from visitors who claim that something from Waverly Hills attached itself to them and followed them back to their homes. These reports follow similar patterns. Unexplained activity beginning within days of visiting Waverly Hills. Phenomena that mirror what was experienced at the sanatorium, such as shadow figures, voices, and feelings of being watched. Activity that often intensifies over time rather than fading, and in many cases, activity that only ceases after religious intervention or formal cleansing rituals. A family from Ohio visited Waverly Hills in 2016 as part of a paranormal tour. Within a week of returning home, they began experiencing severe activity in their house. Doors slamming, objects moving, shadow figures in their bedrooms at night, and most disturbingly, their 8-year-old daughter claiming that a sick man was coming into her room at night and touching her face with cold hands. The family contacted a local paranormal investigation team who performed an investigation and claimed to detect a presence in the home that matched descriptions of entities at Waverly Hills. After a cleansing ritual performed by a local priest, the activity stopped completely. Whether these accounts represent genuine spiritual attachment or psychological suggestion is debatable, but the consistency of reports is notable. Something about Waverly Hills seems to have a lingering effect on people who visit, particularly those who spend extended time in the most active areas of the building. Today, Waverly Hills continues to operate as a tourist attraction and paranormal research facility. The Mattingly family has invested heavily in preserving the building while making it safe for visitors. They run historical tours during the day that focus on the sanatorium's medical history and the tuberculosis epidemic. At night, they offer paranormal tours and allow serious investigation teams to conduct overnight research with proper equipment and protocols. The facility has been featured on countless television shows, including Ghost Hunters, Ghost Adventures, Paranormal Lockdown, and Most Haunted. Every show has documented significant activity, adding to the already substantial body of evidence that something extraordinary is happening at this location. Skeptics argue that Waverly Hills is a perfect storm for false paranormal reports. The power of suggestion from the location's reputation, environmental factors like infrasound from wind moving through the old building creating feelings of unease, and the psychological impact of being in a dark, abandoned building where thousands died. These are valid considerations. And undoubtedly some reported experiences can be attributed to these mundane factors. But they don't explain the thermal imaging footage. They don't explain the consistent EVP recordings made by multiple independent teams using different equipment. They don't explain the physical marks left on witnesses. They don't explain the shadow figures captured on video in locations where no living person was present. And they don't explain why the same specific phenomena, Room 502's malevolence, the death tunnel shadow figures, the children's laughter on the 3rd floor, are reported consistently by witnesses who have no contact with each other and often no prior knowledge of what others have experienced. Something is happening at Waverly Hills Sanatorium. Whether you call it ghosts, residual energy, interdimensional phenomena, or something we don't yet have words for, the evidence suggests that this location has been fundamentally changed by the suffering that occurred within its walls. The dead may not rest easy at Waverly Hills. They may not rest at all. And perhaps most disturbing is the question, if a place can accumulate this much spiritual residue, this much evidence of life after death, what does that mean for our understanding of consciousness, mortality, and the nature of reality itself? Waverly Hills suggests that death might not be the end we've assumed it to be. It suggests that suffering can echo across time, that places can remember, and that under certain circumstances, the boundary between life and death becomes permeable, allowing something to cross back over. The sanatorium still stands on its lonely hilltop, its empty windows staring out over Louisville like the eyes of something patient and watchful. It waits for visitors, for investigators, for anyone curious or brave enough to walk its corridors and descend into its death tunnel. And those who accept that invitation often leave changed, carrying with them experiences that challenge everything they thought they knew about the world. If this journey into one of America's most documented paranormal locations has affected you, if it's made you question the nature of reality and what might exist beyond the veil of death, consider subscribing for more deep explorations of places where our world intersects with the unknown. Leave a comment sharing your thoughts. Do you believe in ghosts? Have you ever experienced something you couldn't explain? Would you be brave enough to spend the night in room 502? Share this video with anyone fascinated by the paranormal and the enduring mystery of what happens when we die. Thank you for watching. And remember, some places remember the dead. And at Waverly Hills, the dead remember us too.